Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the International Institute of Strategic Studies here at Arundel House. Theresa May is having hers today. Enrique Peña Nieto was supposed to be having his on Tuesday, but has cancelled. But arguably the most eagerly anticipated meeting between US President Donald Trump and a foreign leader is that with Vladimir Putin. Now, this is not only because of the controversy around Russia's involvement in the US election campaign, and the victorious candidates' unusually warm and to some highly inappropriate sentiments expressed towards Vladimir Putin. It is principally, rather, because relations between US and the West, between Russia and the West, are in a crisis that has affected every area of their interaction, whether in commerce, finance, diplomacy, or security, and in nearly every region of the world. It is a bitter irony that Barack Obama, who in his first term sought to reset relations with Russia, departed office to the sounds of unprecedented derision from the Russian body politic. The proximate cause of this crisis was Ukraine. The competition from mid-2013 onwards between the EU and Russia over whether Ukraine would sign an EU association agreement. After Russia won that tussle, the outbreak of protests in Ukraine that garnered Western support. Subsequently, in February, the ouster of President Yanukovych, and then followed by the bloodless annexation of Crimea in March 2014, and the attempt to repeat the exercise in eastern Ukraine, which triggered a conflict that to date has claimed approximately 10,000 lives. But as the book argues, this was a crisis long in the making. It concerns competing visions of Europe's post-war Cold War security order and an increasingly contentious zero-sum contest for influence in the States on Russia's western and southwestern periphery. In a moment, I'll hand over to one of the book's two authors, my colleague Dr. Samuel Charup, who's our senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia and formerly served at the planning staff of the US State Department. His talk will run for approximately 25 minutes and it will be on the record. We will remain on the record for the Q&A that will follow. If at the end of the meeting you would like to hear the book's other author, Professor Timothy Colton of Harvard, I direct you to the ISS YouTube channel. Sam.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you all for coming today. I want to start with the cover image of the book. There we go. And what you're seeing there is the destruction of the Donetsk airport, which is officially, or was officially called the Sergei Prokofiev International Airport, in honor of the world-renowned composer. Prokofiev himself was a native of Donetsk, although he identified as an ethnic Russian and spent much of his working life in what is now Russia. The airfield was first built in the 1940s, but then reconstructed at great expense in 2011-2012 as part of the preparations for the co-hosting of the Euro Football Cup that Ukraine in that year did with Poland, and was shiny and new at a brand new passenger terminal, and sort of seemed to reflect the relative prosperity that the Ukrainian industrial heartland at that time had come to enjoy, as well as the country's sort of increased standing in the eyes of outsiders. Starting in May 2014, however, it was systematically destroyed over the course of approximately 9 months. It was changed hands several times, first seized by the insurgents loyal to the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the DNR, in May 2014. And sort of in stages, each part of the airport was ruined. The air traffic control tower, the terminals, the hotel, until it became basically to resemble World War II era Stalingrad. And the tragedy of the siege of the airport is that around 700 human beings died in the course of the fighting over what was a superfluous asset. That was about almost 10% of the total casualties in the conflict. The DNR, of course, had no air force. The Ukrainian military could have used another area to shell downtown Donetsk if they so chose. And in fact, as part of the first Minsk agreement, there was the Ukrainian military was set to retreat from the Donetsk airport, but stayed there because the order to retreat came after the television cameras, which then made it too politically difficult to do so. On national television, they had been lionized as so-called cyborgs, superhuman fighting machines prepared to do battle to the death, as if the airport were some sort of latter-day Alamo. But unlike the Alamo in Texas, the site had no military value to speak of. And unlike the Mexicans who besieged the Alamo in 1836, the rebels here allowed the Ukrainian defenders to rotate in and out over several months, subject to inspection. So we argue in the book that the wrecked airport serves as an apt symbol for the broader ruinous dynamic we observe in the international politics of Eurasia generally and the Ukraine crisis specifically. In game theoretical terms, is the common term that we hear in terms of outcomes is a zero-sum game or a positive-sum game. In the case of a zero-sum game, one player gains while others lose. We argue in the book that the Ukraine crisis is a negative-sum interaction where all major players are worse off at the end of it. And game theory sort of holds that those kinds of scenarios generate the most severe discomfort and discord as the players work their way through them. And that is the core argument, or one core argument of the book, that namely that everyone, Russia, the West, Ukraine first and foremost, and the other countries in between, have in fact lost. But the real central argument that we trace throughout the narrative of the book is about how we got to where we are. And specifically, we argue that today's negative-sum outcome is a product of zero-sum policies that were pursued by Russia, the US, and the EU that developed fitfully in the first decade and a half after the Cold War, but dramatically intensified thereafter. And so that by the mid-2000s, Russia and the West were pursuing policies towards the states of post-Soviet Eurasia that aimed to extract gains at the other side's expense without regard for overlapping or shared interests. Neither invested serious effort in the task of outlining or even contemplating a cooperative regional order that all parties could accept. And the result has been not only the dangerous East-West divide that Nick referred to, but also dysfunction in the politics of the region states themselves, where elites have sought to milk the contestation for their own narrow interests. So we began work on the project in part because we were not satisfied with the prevailing explanations of the Ukraine crisis that have come, that have been printed since the watershed events of early 2014. The most prominent, of course, describes the crisis as a result of Russia's nefarious ambitions towards its neighbors. Through this optic, Moscow harbors long-term strategic objectives of subjugating all of the former Soviet lands, which of course has a grain of truth to it. But to begin and end our understanding of the Ukraine crisis with the alleged grand strategy of regional hegemony assumes that Russia's actions in 2014 and in the broader region occurred in a vacuum. And we argue in the book that the historical record demonstrates that that is not the case. Of course, there has also been the converse argument that the Ukraine crisis resulted primarily from the West's policies towards the region. And that it culminated in the purported plan towards bringing Ukraine into NATO that accelerated towards implementation with the Maidan Revolution. Now, of course, there are a number of factual problems with that narrative, but be that as it may, the broader argument that proponents of this explanation maintain that the West pushed Russia into a corner by seeking to undermine Russia's interests in the region. But that explanation suffers from the same problem, namely that it sort of argues that Western policies were formed it assumes that Western policies were formed in a vacuum. The core argument of the book is that without examining the dynamic interaction between Russian and Western policies over the course of the post-Cold War period, we cannot fully understand the origins of the Ukraine crisis, and that is sort of the game in the sense of the negative-sum game that we describe. There have been other explanations, of course, that have turned the lens from the international to the domestic level or looked at a more structural question of the lack of an inclusive post-Cold War architecture as the prime explanation for the outcome that we observe today. But I think it's important to recall, and I'll get into this in a bit, that Russia had a functional, if unhappy, relationship with the Euro-Atlantic institutions up until 2014. And we argue that that relationship could have persisted if there had not been this test of wills, this contest in the lands between Russia and the West. And it was really that contest that led to the explosion in Ukraine and sent tensions spiraling out of control. And that is the focus of the book. We begin our narrative in the final years of the Cold War, and we argue that the settlement of the end of the Cold War in Europe can be characterized as the settlement that wasn't, given both the questions it left unanswered and the rancor surrounding what was and wasn't agreed. Further, the favor given to what Mary Surratt calls prefab solutions for the regional architecture, the enlargement of Euro-Atlantic institutions without modification, set a time bomb for the future because it would be, of course, impossible to make that a all-inclusive a framework for integration. But the stage was set in this early period, we argue, for a future class along the lines of what we call in the book the three geos. In addition to the familiar geopolitics and geoeconomics, we add geo-ideas, by which we mean policies to spread normative conceptions of the good and the right beyond national borders. And the critical area of interest for our story consists of 6 countries we call the in-betweens, that is, the former Soviet republics flanked by Russia and East Central Europe, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia in the South Caucasus, and Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine in Eastern Europe. In the 90s, the competition in the region was low grade, and there were, of course, some important elements of Russia-West cooperation, particularly the removal of nuclear weapons from Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. But Russia, of course, was already developing the habit of resorting to coercion whenever a neighbor didn't comply with its wishes, and putting up sort of declaratory no trespassing signs along its periphery to warn off Western institutions. And, you know, it's important to remember that this began far before Vladimir Putin appeared on the Russian political scene. And at the same time as well, in the 90s, the West began to see the specter of a new USSR with each case of Russian heavy-handed behavior. And so we call this period, in Boris Yeltsin's phrase, the Cold Peace. Russia was still predominant in the region by default, and the West made some effort not to step on its toes. But what typified the period was not cooperation, but chilly disinterest that was insinuated by the term, and the rise of competition in and over the in-betweens, and to a certain but lesser degree, Central Asia. But that was mostly a tenuous and informal arrangement that emerged in the 1990s and reflected a number of factors which began to fade around the turn of the millennium, namely Russia's relative dominance, the constraints on Russia-West competition, and a shared sense that Russia's institutions and practices were gradually converging with the West. All 3 of those factors faded, of course, pretty dramatically in the first few years of the millennium. But really, it was the color revolutions of 2003 to 2005, and most of all, Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004, that truly kicked off the unraveling of the Cold Peace. The instinct to respond to these breakdowns in opposite and opposing ways also pointed to even more hard-hitting competition on the horizon. But in addition to the outward geopolitical clash that those revolutions caused, they also solidified geo-ideational linkages between domestic politics and international alignments in the region for both Russia and the West. Moscow came to the interpretation that the uprisings were a tool of Western and mainly American policy to remove sitting governments that pursued policies counter to U.S. interests and replace them with figures that would do the Americans' bidding, or if all else failed, just to sow disorder. And for the West as well, the color revolutions led to an intermingling of geopolitics and domestic political change, but of a very different sort. Namely, pro-Western became synonymous with democratic as a descriptor of local political forces, and thus democratic political change and geopolitical gain were seen to go hand in hand, and many saw Russia as an impediment to both. And this was particularly true for top policymakers in the George W. Bush administration. President Bush himself writes in his memoir, quote, "I viewed NATO expansion as a powerful tool to advance the freedom agenda," end quote. These emerging geopolitical and geoideational conflicts lit the fuse for the explosion that came in Georgia in August 2008. The escalations of tension between Russia and Georgia were a function of a number of different factors, but of course the broader environment was in part a function of the tensions that year and the interaction between Russia and the West, and the reality that no visible effort was made at preventative diplomacy in the run-up to the war. But after the Georgia War, and really up to the Ukraine crisis in 2014, this is the so-called reset period, there was a noticeable diminution in the intensity of the overall regional contestation. The example we get into the book that sort of illustrates this takes place outside of the in-betweens, but nonetheless in Kyrgyzstan in April 2010, when then President Kurmanbek Bakiyev was ousted. Russia and the U.S. actually worked in concert, pursuing back-channel talks that actually facilitated his exile and coordinated humanitarian assistance. And at the time, both Russia and the United States had military bases in Kyrgyzstan, the only country where that was true. They went so far, Presidents Obama and Dmitry Medvedev, in June 2010 to issue a joint presidential statement on Kyrgyzstan, something that seems totally fantastical today. However, in the book we argue that this was a deceptive calm that arose from contingent and circumstantial factors that papered over the underlying problem but did not negate its causes. And the fundamental conflict relating to the region had not been addressed and therefore remained a landmine that could detonate at any time if activated. And it was activated in spectacular fashion in Ukraine in 2014. But it was geoeconomics, as Nick indicated, specifically the tug of war over regional economic integration of the in-betweens that we should remember was the immediate trigger for the crisis. As many of you know, in 2009, Brussels had settled on the association agreements as the main framework for engaging these states that aspired to integrate with the EU. And these agreements are very long, but the short version is that they oblige aspirant countries to comply with the acquis communautaire, the rule book of the EU. And that requirement, that is to adopt the acquis, was a powerful lever in the 1990s for reforming the new EU members in East Central Europe. So it was understandable that the EU chose to make that its primary means of engagement. But the association agreements and a key approximation, generally speaking, does not just spur reform. It is also a geoeconomic exercise. So even though fully fledged accession has never been an option for the in-betweens, the geoeconomic distinction between full membership and signature of the association agreement is less ironclad on closer inspection. Because over time, the association agreements would, if implemented, fold these countries into the EU's geoeconomic space. So even before the crisis began, Russia rejected these efforts on principle and countered with a collective initiative of its own. Actually, the announcement of what became the customs union was only a month after the EU rolled out what was called the Eastern Partnership in 2009. But that customs union that Russia was pushing at the time with Kazakhstan and Belarus got off the ground effective January 2010, and of course any number of previous Russian efforts in the region had remained stillborn, but this for once was a concrete step, and it led to the more ambitious Eurasian Economic Union, or EEU, that was launched in 2015. And so the geoeconomic dimension of the regional contestation had thus taken on more significance by the end of 2013. And in that year, in the second half, Russia, reverting to its coercive instincts, put pressure on the four in-betweens that were flirting with the EU, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia, to block their association agreements, and in some cases also to join the EU. And that was the broader context for the Russian pressure on Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in late 2013 that led to his shocking last-minute decision to pull out of the association agreement, which eventually sparked the protests that led to his downfall. And as pandemonium unfolded in Ukraine the next year, Russia and the West sought to influence events to gain the upper hand. Of course, Russia's actions, namely the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in eastern Ukraine, escalated dramatically beyond what had ever been seen before. And Moscow also now presented its terms without any degree of ambiguity or nuance. The Russians have come to insist on ironclad guarantees regarding Ukraine's geopolitical and geoeconomic future, in a deal cinched by the great powers and imposed on Ukraine. For its part, understandably, the West has rejected this out of hand and sought to counter Russia by imposing sanctions and boosting ties with the new government in Kiev. In effect, both sides have effectively doubled down on the very policies that precipitated the crisis in the first place. And much like the interaction before 2014, the diplomatic response to the crisis, compared to the coercive measures undertaken by both sides, was almost an afterthought. And even when talks did occur, little progress was made. But so far, by supporting the Donbass insurgency, Russia has been effectively able to keep Ukraine off kilter, but it is no closer to getting the political settlement that it wants. And that stalemate within Ukraine resonates with a broader international stalemate. For the short term, I don't think, it seems that Kiev's political dysfunction has nullified any immediate risk to Russia of losing Ukraine, so to speak, to the West. But neither side, Russia or the West, has made a good faith effort to find common ground on the core geopolitical and geoeconomic conflict over Ukraine's trajectory. And across the region, a similar dynamic is playing out. Neither the West nor Russia can prevail over the other, while the contest between them is doing damage to the in-between countries themselves. And that damage has most visibly and notably come in the form of the so-called frozen conflicts, but the regional contest has also hamstrung the transition from communism in the in-between countries. And as you know, these states all suffer to varying degrees from a similar set of post-Soviet pathologies, including dysfunctional institutions of modern governance, partially reformed economies that lack functioning markets, pervasive corruption, and weak rule of law. And viewed in comparison with the post-communist countries that joined the EU in 2004, three of which were, of course, former Soviet republics, the in-between's disappointing performance after 1991 comes into vivid relief. And in the book, we provide a number of quantitative measures of economic development and governance that sort of bear this out. I'll go through these pretty quickly. But if you see the blue bar on the far right is a composite index of the 8 post-communist EU countries that joined the EU in 2004, and you see the other 6 countries listed there. These are world governance indicators for various elements of governance, including on political stability, regulatory quality, and control of corruption. And in terms of corruption perceptions, you can also see a pretty dramatic difference between the composite index of the EU 8 and the rest of the region. These are Freedom House scores. Again, the top bar there is the composite index, and you can see the other countries listed. Again, civil liberties from Freedom House. This is an EBRD ranking of competition policy. The difference seems pretty clear. And perhaps I'll end with the charts with this one. This is a GDP per capita comparison using constant 2011, adjusted for purchasing power parity, using 2011 international dollars, the World Bank's measurement. Now, not all of the 8 countries that joined the EU in 2004 have statistics going back all the way to the early 90s, but Poland does. So the dark blue bar at the top is Poland, and you can see that Poland starts actually with a lower GDP per capita than Ukraine and ends up with almost 3 times as much in 2015. So of course, the contest between Russia and the West was not the only factor that produced that disparity that you see in those graphs. But it has fed, we argue, the dysfunction of the in-betweens in important ways. First, the Russian and Western willingness to subsidize political loyalty has made it easier for governing elites to postpone structural reform indefinitely. Further, the zero-sum policies on the part of Russia and Western powers also exacerbated pre-existing political and ethnic cleavages, and in some cases have supplanted democratic discourse with demagoguery. Additionally, the contest for influence has hobbled Western efforts to assist reform in the region, because when the competition with Russia is at the top of the agenda, other problems fall by the wayside. And that's particularly true when the competition is intense, because at those times we've often seen Western policymakers deliberately downplay human rights and democracy-related problems for fear of pushing countries into Russia's embrace. And that kind of soft pedaling of criticism of rulers who pledge fealty but don't comply with the principles feeds a widespread belief in the region that public censure regarding human rights and democracy is merely an instrument to punish disloyalty. So we end the book with some ideas about what is to be done about all of this. It's not the book, I would say 95% of the book is analytical, but we have some prescriptive elements at the end. So the first point is that it's high time to revive the debate over the future of post-Soviet Eurasia and to move past condemnations of the misbehavior of this or that side, and to begin developing innovative and realistic proposals for moving past the negative-sum dynamic. The first step for such a reassessment must be an acknowledgement that current Russian and Western policies towards the region have reached a dead end. It's just not tenable for the West to insist on the right of all countries to make their own choices when it comes to joining Western clubs, while at the same time being unwilling or unable to grant them those choices or to be accountable for the consequences of choosing. And the Kremlin's idée fixe that Russia needs to be the leader of a pack of post-Soviet states in order to be taken seriously as a global power broker is really more of a feel-good mantra than a fact-based strategy, and it irks even Russia's closest allies. So breaking the taboo on open-ended, precondition-free dialogue on the regional order is an essential first step if we are to mitigate the ruinous competition and end the broader Russia-West confrontation that has reached such dangerous levels. Of course, holding talks like that in the current atmosphere is going to be very difficult, and it will take time. There will be no quick deal to fix all of this. In the book, we suggest a few ideas for what those talks might consider, and specifically potential new either institutional arrangements or norms that would allow the in-between region to serve as a bridge between Euro-Atlantic institutions and their Russia-led counterparts. And we have a preliminary list of criteria that the new arrangements would have to meet in order to be effective, that they be acceptable to all parties, that priority be given instead of to unidirectional economic integration, instead be given to economic growth and reform, and that countries be allowed to pursue multi-directional integration as they see fit, that parties to the negotiation seek to mutual agreement before pursuing change to the regional order, i.e. ruling out attempts to make unilateral changes to the status quo, that parties recommit to respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and refraining from the use of force in dispute resolution. And as part of that process, it would be reasonable to expect Russia to commit to withdraw its military from areas where sovereignty is not disputed by any party. And finally, that rather than make the negotiations themselves contingent on resolution of territorial disputes, the arrangement should create status-neutral humanitarian, economic, and security measures in and around conflict zones so that parties would explicitly put the core political disputes on the back burner so that these measures can be negotiated and implemented without crossing any red lines. And of course, even if those criteria are satisfied, a lot of details would need to be worked out. But we should remember that arrangements like this in difficult political climates are not impossible. The Helsinki Final Act, of course, which was perhaps a more ambitious undertaking, was hammered out in the mid-1970s at the height of the Cold War. A necessary first step, we think, is that the West test the proposition that Russia would respond positively to an offer of talks on this matter. So, finally, just as those who rule Russia are convinced that the West will forever push to extend its reach right up to Russia's borders and even inside of them, many Western policymakers are convinced that Russia is a predator state, absolutely committed to the domination of its neighbors. And the sad reality is that neither of these threat perceptions is completely baseless. And those who hold them can rightly point to numerous reasons why the talks we propose might fail. But the dire consequences of the path we're on, both for Russia, the West, and the countries in between, more than justify an attempt at least to find agreement. Thank you.
Alexander Puchlak, Embassy of Ukraine. Mr. Sharp, I would like to reiterate the stance of my country that Ukraine is fully committed to peaceful resolution of this conflict. But unfortunately, every day we see the lack of willingness from Russian side to de-escalate the situation on Donbass. My point is that Russian Federation created this conflict deliberately to control or destroy Ukraine. It was made in the same way in Moldova and Georgia. In this regard, I have a question to you. Is it acceptable in 21st century to make any concessions for the state which denies the right for neighboring states to be sovereign countries? Thank you.
Should we collect a few? Yeah, let's collect a few. Odysseus, please. Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Orisa Lutsevich. I lead Ukraine Forum program at Chatham House. Well, congratulations on the book, Sam. I think it was not an easy undertaking to do an analysis of that sort. I think it adds to the body of academic, literature also for people who are trying to understand Eurasia. But I think maybe it's the question. From what I understood, you missed the third whole cause of the crisis, which is in a way reflected in the cover of your book. You called it superfluous asset. I mean, I was in that airport in October 2012, and for many in Ukraine, that airport was also a symbol of corruption, big corruption. So if you come back to the slides on governance indicators and the way Ukraine compared to Poland and cumulative EU, you could see why the whole Euromaidan movement erupted. Of course, European Union, as you analyzed it as a competition with Russia, was in a way a symbolic dream for Ukrainians to get rid of that corruption. I have not read the book. Maybe you talk about these origins of a local crisis, why it erupted. And I think that a relative prosperity that you mentioned at the beginning that was taking place during Yanukovych, it was bonkers. It was not true. There was relative prosperity for his family, but that was about it. Actually, any revolution, as you know, also erupts from the crack within the ruling class. And the fact that there was that fissure inside Yanukovych and other oligarchs surrounding him was the cause of the crisis. I think will never, in a way, I wish the Western Russia resolves the conflict. I wish Ukrainian people stop dying, but in a way, realistically, I don't see this happening in the midterm because the struggle in Ukraine is for this governance indicator that you put on. And if the West, the cumulative West, stops supporting, let's say, Ukraine, Armenia, Moldova, Georgia, Belarus, whoever, on this way, this struggle will continue. It will last longer, but it will continue. You cannot suppress the emancipation of society by making a grand deal. This is what I mean. And I think it's important in your analysis to pay attention to this dynamic. Thank you.
Sorry, if you can just pass it to the gentleman in front. That's a third one then of this round, and then we'll go back to Sam, and then I'll gather some more.
Yes, hello, Mark Kilbane. I've spent the last year in the Donbass working for the OSCE. And my question to you is, do you, as part of one of the planks of any top-level negotiation, would you consider, or do you think the participants of such talks might consider a referendum inside the Donbass, and that referendum would offer many, like 5 different options? Reunite with Ukraine 100%, reunite with Russia 100%, limited autonomy holding Ukrainian passports, limited autonomy under Russian leadership, or complete and total sovereignty. So lay it on the table. And it would be a high-risk move, but I wanted to know what your thoughts might be.
Well, those were easy questions. is it acceptable to make compromises with states that violate their neighbors' sovereignty? Rather than answering that directly, I'll just note that it happens in international politics. That according to the United States, throughout the post-World War II period, the Soviet Union was illegally occupying 3 Baltic states. Nonetheless, not only the Helsinki Act was signed, but any number of other agreements between the US and the Soviet Union. So it happens. Whether it's acceptable or not is up to the political leaders who make those decisions, not me, to decide what's acceptable or not in a given political climate. Eurasia, I agree with pretty much everything you said. We do in the book get into the fact that the large protests that came out after the assault on the unarmed students on November 30th, 2013, largely was about the Yanukovych regime and not anything else, really, and that there was a distinct domestic dynamic that had little to do with this outside contest. But the fact is that the contest among the external powers after the revolution itself is what has been driving a lot of the crisis that we now find ourselves in. So I totally agree that there was a genuine dissatisfaction among both the politically active population and the oligarchs with Yanukovych's rule, and that is what explains his downfall. But actually the book is not about explaining the change of power in Kiev. It's about explaining the broader international dynamic. I don't advocate the West stopping support for reform in these societies. I do think that it will be impossible to have sustainable reform if the contest continues at the degree it is today. And I think that we are fooling ourselves if we think we can continue to maintain the intensity of the degree of geopolitical and geoeconomic competition in the region and also have successful reform. And in no way does this end up being a grand bargain in our recommendations. All the parties concerned would have to be at the table, and that includes the countries affected by the agreement and the countries that any country that would be party to it would have to agree to it. So I don't like that term, and we certainly don't advocate it. I'm not sure a referendum in Donbass would necessarily be what I would recommend for this things going forward. And I think ultimately where we end up in the book on the question of, and this is meant to last, the book at least, a bit longer than the resolution of the Minsk process. Let's put it that way. So I think putting the Minsk process and the question of conflict resolution in the Donbass in the broader regional context, because even if miraculously the Minsk agreements were implemented, really that wouldn't put an end to the broader contestation in any way. It would just sort of move it to a non-military domain in Ukraine, although Crimea, of course, would be an exception to that statement, but nonetheless it would go on. There is, of course, a trade war also going on. There is an energy, conflict also going on, and none of that would be affected by, complete implementation of the Minsk agreements, as desirable as that might be from a humanitarian perspective. So that ultimately, unless embedded in a broader understandings, a settlement in eastern Ukraine is unlikely to be durable.
Super. Right. Two, firstly, on this side of the room. Lady at the front, please.
My name is Lisa. I'm from Ukraine here. I'm doing Master of Public Policy in Oxford. My background is in political science, but I want to ask a question about more grassroots of Ukrainian and Russian life in general. There are, in my opinion, two very big problems. One problem is the lie that became like a currency of Russian politics in general for Russian public, and hatred that exists between our two nations. And actually, the problem is that, I have experience in being in Moscow, and I know what young people think and like the trend is such a huge that they actually really hate Ukrainians. They're so emotional about that, and nobody is actually addressing that problem. So it creates really negative consequences on the long term. What can you say about who should address this problem of reconciliation? Should it be, I don't know, a Russian problem, Ukrainian problem, or it should be actually international? Some efforts should be spent on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then 2 rows back in the middle, you and Grant, please.
Thank you very much. As the gentleman said, Ewan Grant, I'm a border control advisor. I was working in a European Commission project in Kiev shortly before and immediately after the Maidan events. I did have to smile at your opening comments because way back, although I didn't realize it at the time, I did see the enormous ethnic and cultural strains in the Soviet Union when I was on board a Soviet warship. And a year later, I have to say, I did see something rather similar in the United States when I was at the Alamo. It was quite striking, the ethnic groups not mixing. My question is, how do you see the various elements in the West working together on handling things in the future and perhaps rectifying some of the mistakes made in the past? Because it strikes me that one of the crucial differences is that the US does do geopolitics, but as Edward Lucas of The Economist has argued, the EU doesn't. And frankly, in the whole aspects of relationships with Russia and the other states in the Western ex-Soviet Union, is that, frankly, the European central institutions can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you.
So, was lady second row, were you going to ask a question? Yeah. Thank you.
Elena Karachirova, specialized on Ukrainian crisis. My question is about Eastern Partnership. How do you see it in the future, and is there a possibility for Intermarium to replace it, with being replaced with?
Reconciliation. Well, clearly the parties who are involved in a dispute need to be involved in the reconciliation, but usually there has to be a third-party facilitator to make it work. So I think the answer to the first question is all of the above. Reconciling the various elements in the West, boy, that's a tough one. I think if there were a silver bullet, it would have been found before. I do think that part of this has to do with being more aware of the multifaceted nature of the contest and the crisis. So, for example, you know, the reality that there wasn't much thinking about what if Russia, objected or made trouble in the context of implementation or signature of the association agreements, was the U.S. wasn't really in a position to do anything about that because it had basically left the whole process to the EU. I say this not because the U.S. should have been managing it or that needed to necessarily be involved, but that there wasn't, I think, a full discussion of all the elements of the broader regional contest, and there was no holistic approach, which led to all these policies going in different directions at the same time. But I don't think I know how to fix that immediately. The Eastern Partnership in the future. I'm not sure. I see the idea of a Black Sea to Baltic Sea alliance as necessarily replacing the Eastern Partnership. I mean, the Eastern Partnership exists. It will continue to exist. I think the real challenge is whether a key approximation is the tool that will ultimately prove successful in reforming those countries that have signed the association agreement. In other words, if it is just a change in formal rules and standards that has been the core of the problem in political economies of the region, then you would expect a change in those formal rules to higher standards to be the silver bullet, so to speak, to be what's needed to fix it. But in fact, many of the pathologies in the region result from the power of informal politics and in fact, overwhelming power of informal rules and relationships over formal institutions. So just adopting Western European standards in a way, well, we will see over time, but the key challenges relating to informal politics are much harder to fix with a key approximation than others. And I think, you know, the question needs to be asked, just because it worked in one part of post-communist Europe, will it necessarily work in another?
Without the promise.
Right.
Ben Bilski, please, right there at the front.
Thank you. And Benjamin Bilski, Pericles Foundation. Just a quick question on how you perceive the risk of the new American president walking into something of a Yalta-type trap that might be prepared for him, and how this also might affect divisions within his cabinet between the professionals and the campaign set on this question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then could you go to the back there, please, gentleman by the window. James, Oksana, Ben, I haven't forgotten you, and I will get to you.
Matt Simons, I recently became a trustee of this institute. I think I had a very same question as the gentleman at the front, which is, I can only presume that much of your book was written before the election of Donald Trump, and I'm very curious to know how you see the negotiation dynamics playing out in this instance between him and Putin.
Thank you. Lily, sorry to work you again. Ben Bilski at the front, please. Oh no, you've already asked a question. Then it's James Nixie, sorry, in the corridor there.
Thanks, Nick. James Nixie, Chatham House colleague of Eurasia. Hi, Sam. And congratulations. Difficult undertaking, I agree, I know. If I understood your presentation correctly, the standout feature of your analysis is your determination to, well, at least what came across was to equally apportion blame, or rather in think tank parlance, that is, determine the drivers. That's what we say, isn't it? But it's the same thing, right? I'm not necessarily sure I agree, but I take the point. But then you towards the end, as you came onto your recommendations and you gave examples, you used the Helsinki Final Act as an example. But if the Helsinki Final Act is about anything, it's about the sovereignty of nominally independent states. But your third recommendation, if I understood it correctly, I think it was your third, was that it's now not tenable for these states to be able to define their own futures. I can't remember exactly. I think you said something like that in your third recommendation. So I don't really understand. You're holding up the Helsinki Act as a model to go forward, but then you're saying, if I've understood you correctly, Sam, please correct me if I have not.
Will.
Then not at all. Okay, but then actually, as far as I can see, you actually want to change to the Helsinki Final Act. Okay, all yours.
Thanks, James. On Trump, I was waiting for that to come. So it's very hard for me to imagine how the Ukraine crisis can be resolved in a U.S.-Russia bilateral context. There are simply too many stakeholders, it would seem to me, to first and foremost, because the U.S. actually doesn't really have a formal role in the main diplomatic process that deals with the conflict, and thus even if he wanted to, it's going to be difficult to trade it away, so to speak. So if there is to be a deal, so to speak, and if it were to be a good one, it would require patient diplomacy, it would require working with allies and partners, it would require tough negotiation over time, and it would be difficult. And the question of attention span then comes into play, and we don't really have much of a record on that with the new U.S. president. So, you could imagine a lot of deals that dealt with part of it, but the idea that it could be fully dealt with in a U.S.-Russia context seems implausible to me at this point. That having been said, there is a broader dynamic here, and there could be, at least, in the context of the U.S. and Russia under this new U.S. administration. And it's very complicated and probably a longer story than we can get into here. But the short version is that the Ukraine crisis, among other issues such as the Iran deal and the Trump administration's attitude towards China, are these kinds of questions that, you can desire to have a better relationship with Russia all you want, but unless you deal with the problems that result from, so to speak, third issues that aren't purely bilateral, it's nearly impossible to do so. And the last 3 years should really be an ample demonstration of that. As for James' question, actually we explicitly avoid and say we are not in the business of apportioning blame. So I do reject that equivalence that you made there between drivers and blame. And it's not just about equality, or it's not actually at all about equality. It's about the dynamic interaction between actors and policies, that you can't really understand one side if you analyze it in isolation, and that there was an interplay here that progressively escalated over time. And so that, I think, is how I would frame it, rather than equal apportioning of blame. In terms of the Helsinki Final Act, and so just to clarify, what I said wasn't a recommendation, it was more about where to start in terms of accepting that we've reached a dead end in terms of both Russian and Western policies, is that the current Western insistence on freedom of choice that you mentioned, by the way, a principle that goes back, including to the Helsinki Final Act, but more specifically and more explicitly in the Charter of Paris in 1990, and has been the source of disagreement in a way ever since. Another geo-ideational split, with the Russians emphasizing the indivisibility of security and the West focusing on the freedom of choice. In any case, it's not tenable to insist, for the West to insist on freedom of choice, if it is not prepared to grant those choices. And to accept the consequences of states choosing. That's what I said, not about the states themselves making those choices. They're free to make whatever choices they like. And so that, I think, was what I had in mind. And the Helsinki Final Act, right, so that's right. I think I answered that question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Final round. Can we start, please, with Oksana Antonienko? And then Lily will have two for you.
Well, for those who don't know me, I'm Sam's predecessor here. So, Sam, congratulations, excellent paper. I agree completely with your analysis. In fact, I recall, my analysis of the war in 2008 in Georgia was entitled "The War with No Winners," and it exactly talked about the zero-sum or negative-sum dynamic which prevailed even then. And yet, it was very well understood that this is what it was. And we had at that time a window of opportunity with Medvedev and Obama and reset and the European Security Treaty and all the talk about the NATO-Russia rapprochement. And yet, there was never been a possibility to achieve, any understanding. I think today we're in a much darker place. I think to walk from where we are now with that picture behind you, 10,000 lost lives, and the complete breakdown of trust, breakdown of arms control regime, breakdown of institutions, breakdown of norms, which continues also with Trump and others. So I agree with your analysis, but I wonder whether your prescription about the need to reach an overarching understanding is a little bit too optimistic for the context in which we really exist, and whether what we really need to think in terms of a strategy is really a small steps approach in which things like reconciliation, as was talked about, or confidence building measures, or something which can really move us slightly in the direction of rebuilding trust is something we should be focusing on. Because any talk about the grand bargain, and I, just like you, I don't believe that Trump and Putin is capable of reaching a bargain, nor that it is desirable, in fact. That is something which will be just distracting us from the kind of very urgent task that we need now to start rebuilding European security.
Thank you. And then two questions in the middle there. Ben Barry and Desmond Bowen, they're next to each other. Ben, could you raise your hand? So,
I'm from the ISS. Sam, the view from the Kremlin with regard to Russian minorities in its near abroad, how would you characterize it now?
I'm Desmond Bowen, and I'm a IISS member. Bravo for the analysis, but also for trying to look out for some solutions to resolve the problem, which I think is really interesting for policy people. My question really is whether it really is a big step to think that Russia and the West, however you characterize the West, and we're not quite sure what the West means, particularly now, could actually row back from the position that they got themselves into and say, well, maybe we made some mistakes, and let's think about doing things in a different way and operating at this boundary, as it were, in a different way. I mean, do we actually have to reconcile ourselves not to a frozen conflict, but to an unstable area and a deliberate effort at sustaining instability along that boundary as something that we're going to have to manage and live with? I mean, it just seems to me that that's a much more likely outcome than a solution which cut and dried gives us a new York or anything else. I mean, what do you think about that?
So I should clarify, based on a previous question, that yes, this was fully submitted to the publishers before November 8th, so I did it with, Oksana, 100% agree we're in a much darker place, and we do get into the European Security Treaty proposal episode, but we are in a much darker place today. And frankly, the basic fundamental recommendation in the book is about beginning to talk about these issues. It really isn't about proposing a specific agreement. The ideas that I threw out there are things we say are things that could be considered if those talks were to begin, but that we need to begin open-ended, precondition-free dialogue on the fundamental problems, or else we're never going to get anywhere. So I do think that the details are probably are in fact too optimistic, but they're sort of meant to be food for thought as to what this kind of negotiation might address, rather than specific proposals. And I do agree that it's hard to imagine an actual agreement right now. The problem is the status quo is unsustainable and suboptimal for all parties, right? So something should give, even if it doesn't have to, right? Russian minorities, Ben. I have never seen this issue as a fundamental driver of policy. It has often been a public relations cover for policy decisions made for other reasons. It does have domestic political resonance, though, that having been said, and there are a lot of emotional resonances when this issue comes up. I think there are fundamental differences to how it plays out in the context of Eastern Ukraine than how it does in Estonia and Latvia, though. So I wouldn't look for a universal attitude towards Russian minorities across the board. Do we have to reconcile ourselves to regional instability? Well, I do think that's likely to be, that is where we are, and unless things change pretty significantly, that is where we're likely to be. But rather than resign ourselves to an outcome that serves no state's interests, that has led to so much death and destruction, I sort of see it as the job of outside observers to say, hey, maybe you might think about trying a different path, that this might not be, that prolonged regional instability with all these international consequences really is not, ain't working for anybody. And if we can find something better, well, if it is possible to find something better, we should try, at least try. And I think one of the problems has been is that there hasn't been a genuine attempt to do so. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I've got to bring this to a close now. If you're an ICE member, you should already have your copy of the book. If you don't, you can buy it from reception or else from the website. I'd like to thank you very much for coming along, and please join me in thanking Sam.